have the opportunity to speak to you. I wish it could have been in person and that I could have, um, had the opportunity to get to know the students face to face a little bit, as well as colleagues in Helsinki. But I'm also grateful for the technology that makes this happen. I am just recovering from an illness, so if my voice gets a little hoarse, that's why. But I think I should be able to make it through with the help of uh, my hot water by my side. Um, and I do very much welcome, the question and answers that will follow, as well as do encourage you also, if you have particular questions or if you're working on a research project, to feel free to be in touch. All right. So my topic today is Christianity on Taiwanese stages. Why Halleluja? And what I hmm? ah, and I think it maybe is appropriate to come at this a little bit biographically, at least to begin with. I finished, my late adolescent years were in Hong Kong, and then I spent quite a lot of time, some years in PRC, so People's Republic of China, cities such as Nanjing and Quanzhou, in which I worked in theaters, while also continuing my studies and working as a translator, for instance, helping theater troops with their titles and their travel abroad, and dealing with collaborations, usually with Europe, often with France. And it was then, just as I was finishing my doctoral studies, that I had the opportunity to go to Taiwan, which I didn't know well at that time, and spend a year as a Fulbright scholar. And I was situated in the National Taiwan College of Performing Arts, which is, a theater training school. And so that was a really fantastic opportunity to understand the landscape of Taiwanese performing arts, including various genres, but especially what we might call Chinese opera. So that's a bit of a contested term. You can see maybe why people throughout East Asia are not always keen on saying, Western opera equals East Asian theater arts. We don't call kabuki Japanese opera, or no Japanese opera, so it's not necessarily the best thing to call this family of arts Chinese opera, but it's the term that people tend to understand, and probably you have some idea of what is Chinese opera. So I will use it today to avoid confusion. And one very striking thing about going to Taiwan for me was that all of a sudden I was encountering these Christian versions of Chinese opera. And so you can see here on the left, the Book of Ruth. Obviously, that's a Bible story, a Bible book. Naboth's Vineyard, a less well-known, I think, Bible story. But as you can probably gather, they are in Taiwanese, so Taiwanese Hokkien, the variety of Chinese, which is very distant from Mandarin, and unintelligible with Mandarin, and that's the sort of main performing language for indigenous Taiwanese performing arts, including all of the native opera forms. So you can tell it's in Chinese, but you can probably also tell maybe from the sleeves, from the costumes, that we're not really in the Middle Eastern Holy Land Bible world that you would expect if you were going to watch, say, a Hollywood production about the Bible. The Book of Ruth is not going to look like that. So it's a really striking adaptation, form of expression, and that led me to a project for, since then, really, I've followed what these various Christian troops have done. And so it was sort of a student newspaper that gave me the title for that project and for this talk, because I think a lot of Taiwanese people and people in the Chinese-speaking world more generally share my surprise when they come across this form of theater. So this is a student journalist writing about coming across this Christian theater. From the stage come the familiar sounds of Gezaixi, or Goahi, as it's called in Taiwanese Hokkien. But once you listen carefully, how come the words they're singing are Halleluja? So I talked a bit about Chinese opera. Chinese opera comes in many different varieties. The dominant genre for so-called Chinese opera in Taiwan is Gezaixi, which is sometimes translated as Taiwanese opera, especially when it goes abroad, for instance. Not a very ancient form. Our oldest records about this form of theater go back sort of 120, 130 years, but dominated by women performers. So most male roles are also performed by women. I don't know if you can see on the left here in the Book of Ruth, for instance, that's a woman playing a male role. So that's a really major form of theatrical expression, and closely associated for many with Taiwanese identity, along with some other performing arts such as the puppet form, the puppet theater, glove puppet theater called Budaishi Potehi. So for people working in Chinese theater, the association of Chinese opera with religion is completely ordinary. So everybody expects, at least at its root, Chinese opera to have religious roots. So we have here, so Daniel Overmeyer, if you're focusing on religious studies and come across or are dealing with Chinese religion, you may see this late professor's name pretty often. Major scholar of incredible fieldwork all over northern China. And he notes in one of his papers, most Chinese opera stories are about the struggles of gods and human heroes with demons and villains, stories that dramatize traditional values and help clarify the distinction between good and bad actions. And this tends to be also the defense of Chinese opera against modernity. So when you have in the 20th century, early 20th century intellectuals, mostly in China rather than in colonial Taiwan, saying, well, we don't want traditional Chinese opera anymore. We want to do spoken theater. Spoken theater is modern. It can be a vehicle for modern ideas and modern philosophy. We need to reform theater. Very standard view in China in the 10s, 20s, and 30s. The response tends to have been that traditional theater is important as a vehicle for values, for ethics. And so those ethics may be a sort of Confucian rags to riches, be respectful to your parents, serve your parents, serve the monarch, serve the liege, be a loyal and true friend. It can be that sort of Confucian ethics, which I think most people would not qualify as religious. Although whether these categories are very useful for East Asia is another question. But more often than the Confucian narrative, you will have various Buddhist and Taoist accounts. So the Mulian opera is an example of a very common Buddhist opera. It involves a woman who is sent to hell after her death because of all the lives she has taken through eating meat. And then her son sort of harrows hell, descends into hell in order to rescue her. And the karmic conclusions, the karmic sort of ethics are core Buddhism, and this was performed pretty much all over China. It's still performed today. Or Taoism, you'll see, I think I have a couple of slides later on, local gods, maritime gods in the Hokkien region, in the sort of in Taiwan, for instance, a lot of theater around Mazu, the goddess who protects sailors. That would be a pretty standard, but just in general, the whole canon of Taoist gods and saints and deified humans is standard material for theater. So struggles of gods and human heroes. Wild Idema, who's a drama scholar rather than a religion scholar, says it's difficult to find a form of traditional Chinese drama that has not preserved some remnants of its original ritual function. And so, although it is the case that, and perhaps you've covered some of this, there is, a suppression of religion, a very drastic suppression of religion in China, for instance, during the Cultural Revolution, but in general, through most of the communist period, it remains the case that if you know a theater well in China, most of the theater groups will have rituals associated with performance. So for instance, if you were to perform the Mulian show, you would have to eat vegetarian. All the actors would have to eat vegetarian. And if they don't, bad things may happen. Then there's altars in quite a lot of theaters, both in China and Taiwan. There are particular gods or patron saints who are associated with theaters and theater performers and musicians. And I think the consensus in Chinese drama studies is that at its root, most theater has the emergence of theater has ritual and religious reasons, and then later has commercial and literary expressions that might take it in a different direction for some very famous forms of theater or very famous dramas. But at the root, at the core, there remains a ritual and religious function. So the fact that there is a religious aspect to these pieces, these productions, is not surprising. But what is surprising is that it is Christianity. So Chinese opera derives from narratives and dramas that circulated in the late imperial period. So, we have records from earlier, but what we have a good idea of how theater was really performed in China, it comes from maybe the 12th century. And then in the 20th century, Chinese theater, as it sort of enters, Chinese opera, as it enters the modern period, has to defend itself as a form of tradition, as a sort of crystallization of culture. That can mean, so one of the great actors of the 20th century, Mei Lanfang, is dispatched to the Soviet Union, the United States, Japan in the 20s and 30s in order to convince audiences abroad and theater makers, including major figures like Meyerhold and Bertolt Brecht, and Broadway and Hollywood figures, that Chinese opera is also a classical form. And that tends to elevate a certain form of Chinese theater, and then other forms acquire sort of the label of being an expression of regional culture. We don't have a lot of time to talk about the details of Taiwanese political history, although some of it was in your reading. But it is worth knowing that after Taiwan is ceded to the Republic of China in 1945 at the end of the Second World War, and the nationalist government takes over from the Japanese colonial government, there is an overt suppression of forms of native, indigenous, depending on how you want to call it, Hokkien, Taiwanese speaking culture in favor of national forms, that is to say, Chinese forms, specifically Beijing opera, which at the time is called national opera. It's opera form you're perhaps familiar with. And so all of the state funding, the state education, the space on the airwaves is dedicated to basically a Mandarin language form that arrives from the mainland with the new nationalist government, which controls Taiwan. And the local forms of theater like Gezaixi, so what might be called Taiwanese opera, or the puppet forms, are suppressed for a long time, although very popular among the people, but they're not given a lot of airway space. There aren't given any subsidies. At times, there are attempts to make them try to switch to Mandarin in order to perform. So there's a whole pretty heavy and direct attempt to replace, really, Taiwanese local culture with Mandarin-speaking arts. One Hokkien form, Gezaixi, becomes, partly through that process of oppression, I think, closely associated with Taiwanese identity and becomes marketed later then as Taiwanese opera. And that's the form that we're looking at today. This is from your reading, but just to remind you, we are talking, when we're talking about Christianity in Taiwan, about a relatively small minority. There are certain groups where it is a very large proportion, particularly the Aboriginal population, that is to say the non-Chinese population, which is Austronesian related to Filipinos and Indonesians, much greater percentage of Christianity there. But in the general population, general Han Chinese population, it remains a small minority divided between many denominations, but has historically been politically very powerful. Again, that's sort of in your reading. I won't go into it in great detail, but I think it's worth noting that it's been politically powerful across the spectrum, although perhaps in different denominations. That is to say, both the nationalist government, Chiang Kai-shek and his son, Jiang Jingguo, were Christians. 5 of the 7 presidents of the ROC have been Christians. But on the what's called the green side, so what you might think of as the pro-autonomy or pro-sovereignty side of Taiwanese politics, the Presbyterians particularly have been historically very powerful and very active in the democratization movement, for instance. So one of the major churches mentioned in your readings is that Taiwanese Presbyterian Church, and we will also see them as sponsors of theater moving forward. I think it's worth noting, so what part of what the rationale, if we look at the interviews with the theater makers, has been to try and expand the audience of Christianity, to try and expand the uptake of Christianity among what might be thought of as the sort of the popular classes. So there is a sense among certain Christian groups that Christianity has been in a relatively narrow band of middle class or affluent groups, as well as among the Aboriginals. It carries a certain high social status, but remains in some way ineradicably foreign or Western. And there's been a long animus, I would say, against traditional customs and folk religious practices. That is to say, forms of Christianity have set themselves up against the sort of syncretic Taoist, Buddhist forms of religion that you see in temple festivals, for instance. And that is part of the reason, I think, why it's surprising to see Christian Gezaixi, Christian Taiwanese opera, because the assumption will usually be that belongs to a folk form of culture, that it is close to maybe idolatry, that it's sort of natural in Christian terms, that its natural expression is to honor gods and sometimes deified humans, and that's typically anathema for Christians. And so there's a historical barrier between forms of popular culture, such as Gezaixi Taiwanese opera, because of its association with a lively religious life of community temples and local deities, festivals, and rituals. It's part of an economy of offerings and rituals designed to assure personal and community peace, prosperity, and health. And these benefits are ensured by entertaining and propitiating divinities and ghosts who might otherwise become vengeful or mischievous. And so if that's the purpose of your temple festival and your theater, which might also be puppet theater, is as part of that propitiation, is as part of that religious practice, then it has historically been too associated with those forms of religion and ritual to be feasible as a Christian form until, so here, sorry, you can see, for instance, on the left, a Taoist production, or on the right, what a sort of temple festival theater might look like. I wanted to mention in passing a form of institutional adoption of Gezaixi by a different religion, that is to say, from the large Buddhist charities and organizations in Taiwan, which have been doing sort of biographies of virtuous monks and various other Buddhist forms in a way that puts the theater on larger stages with bigger budgets in major parts of Taiwan, in a way that also brings it to a larger audience and to a sort of higher production value than we had seen in the usual sort of temple rounds, which are usually outdoor stages, temporary stages, as part of temple festivals, as part of syncretic or Taoist religious practice. So there is also a movement at the same time as the Christian stuff, and probably I would say a better funded movement to make Gezaixi narratives as part of the large Buddhist organizations of Taiwan. So that's another point of interest. All right, so the Christian Gezaixi has three sort of possible, at least that I'm aware of, that I've identified, ways of staging Christian themes. The first of them are actual Bible stories, like the Book of Ruth, which I showed you earlier. The second are missionary stories, principally those around one given missionary, George Leslie Mackay, a Canadian missionary in the north of Taiwan at the end of the 19th century. I'll show you some excerpts from that. And then I just do want to mention that some of the Gezaixi troops, the Taiwanese opera troops that are identified as being that have as their mission Christian proselytizing, may also do simple sort of moral fables that are not explicitly religious. So not all of their repertoire is necessarily Bible or missionary or overtly Christian. If they find it consonant or in harmony with Christian faith and ethics, then they also do other plays that they generally write themselves, which are I think which they regard as assisting their mission, without being explicitly Christian in content. All right, so this is the woman who is generally credited with the founding of Gospel Gezaixi. So the direct translation of what I've been calling Christian Gezaixi is Gospel Gezaixi, Fuyin Gezaixi, is Liu Nanfang. So she is somebody who worked for about 10 years in Gezaixi before she decided to directly combine it with her Christian faith. If some of you can read Chinese, you can see the interview on the left is an interview, a long interview with her on Christian television, which also broadcasts a lot of these theater pieces, in which she has sort of a moment of epiphany where she prays to God to help Gezaixi performers sort of improve in their art, and that leads her to founding a particular troupe, There are several troupes. So when I say she's the founder, I believe she's the person who first sort of wrote plays in this direction. And she's also somebody on whom there's a lot of material because she wrote I believe it's a master's thesis on her work producing Christian Gezaixi. And so she's an eloquent and self-aware practitioner of Gezaixi. She doesn't come from a Taiwanese Hokkien speaking family. She comes from a mainlander family, but was taken to see Gezaixi from early age. Actually learned a mainland form of Chinese theater, Kunqu, sort of as a performer first, but then went to work in Gezaixi. And I think a lot of her views on Gezaixi are about elevating both as an art and because she regards Christianity as an elevation over the idol worship in Christian terms of folk religious practice and traditional beliefs. So she notes this is from her period when she was still working as a Gezaixi sort of playwright and creative staff. So at the time, perhaps it is no different now in Taiwan, many kinds of theater companies, no matter how modern, would all set up incense tables and ask for a harmonious performance. On one occasion, when those actors noticed that I was not praying in the usual fashion, that I hadn't set up an incense table, they began to think that I had turned my back on tradition. So she sets up this tension that she felt at the time between the usual ritual practices of offering incense in order to ensure a successful production. She noticed that the actors, that she hadn't set up the incense table and that she's therefore, not adhering to tradition. And that's sort of one of the moments in which she realizes that for her, she needs to combine what is the artistic tradition with her own faith, that she can't countenance, or she can't, she would rather not continue with the usual rituals of Gezaixi, but would rather combine it with her Christian faith. And very energetically, she set up her own troupe and began to produce in 2002. Another troupe named after a biblical figure is the Esther Gezaixi troupe, and they are very active at the moment. As you can imagine, because of COVID and other challenges, I haven't been to Taiwan recently, but fortunately for me, a lot of these activities are well documented online, and there's also videos. And Esther Gezaixi troupe is also the troupe that has taken to sort of making filmed versions of their gospel theater. And as you can see from the Facebook About page quote that I've translated here, it's explicitly for proselytizing purposes, founded jointly by brothers and sisters who adore Gezaixi and love God, hoping to disseminate the gospel of the Lord's love through Bible stories performed as Gezaixi. This is Liu Nanfang's troupe, the Taiwan traditional opera troupe. So this is the earliest one. The gospel Gezaixi is often set up to be performed during the Ghost Festival, during Pudu, because that's the moment that is felt to be the darkest in the traditional Chinese ritual calendar, when the worlds of the ghosts and the worlds of the human are closest. During Pudu festival performances, generally there will often be sort of a row of seats that are empty because they're to be filled by spirits. And so this is felt by the Christian troops as a moment where the gladsome and light infused news of Christianity might be particularly effective, because it can bring, the glad tidings at a moment when the Chinese traditional calendar is rather somber. As you can see, there's been considerable success. Sometimes I'm told that the troops set themselves up sort of right outside temples that are doing the Pudu festival, so that it's a kind of direct competition between the two kinds of theater. And the other festival time, the other time when I see a great deal of production is around Christmas, for obvious reasons. So in December, you will also see quite a lot of productions. And there have been, although I think in general the tendency is to do Old Testament texts, we have also seen I have seen accounts of performances of the Nativity. So actually of doing, the birth of Christ as Gezaixi. So here's one example, which is the Book of Ruth. And I will show you a clip if this works. And this clip, I want you to look particularly at what's going on in terms of costumes and give some thought to how they might be adapting it. So, I mean, this is sort of a market scene. This is the Esther troops where I was mentioning that they now produce filmed versions. What I was just hoping you would notice is that, or that might be apparent to you, is that it's sort of a mix. I mean, we're clearly, there's no real attempt to make it in the Middle East. But if you look at the at the sort of beads and veils and colors that are in use, they are typical of the way that on the Taiwanese opera in general, in the Xiqu, the Chinese opera stage, we find sort of Western areas inhabited. So we're clearly filming sort of in a forested area in Taiwan. Everybody evidently is a Hokkien Taiwanese speaker. There's not a lot of effort. There's no effort in terms of makeup to pretend that people are of a different race or ethnicity. Everybody is sort of transparently Taiwanese, but then in the costumes, you have these notes, these sort of indications that we are in an exotic place. This is still from the Book of Ruth. I'm not sure it'll start at the right place, but we'll give it a shot. No. So if you know the Book of Ruth, the story is about two women who are not Jews, but who marry Jews. They're Moabite women who marry Jews, and after the deaths of their husbands, one of them remains and one of them leaves. The one who remains is Ruth, and she's then noted for her great care of her mother-in-law Naomi. And so this is a really attractive story, partly because it's about filial piety, so about the great care of a daughter-in-law for a mother-in-law. It's also attractive, I think, because it's about conversion. So it's about, not initially belonging to a troupe, but recognizing God. Another, I think, feature of it that makes it frequently performed is that one of the great sort of highlights of Gezaixi, or one of the Taiwanese opera, one of the traits associated with it is grief and mourning. So people often call it sort of crying opera. And so because the husbands die, you have this opportunity for a tragic scene, which then can be devolved into a scene of, or can be followed by a scene of recognition of the true Lord. So maybe we'll just have a few seconds of the crying, and then I'll try to find the true Lord moment. All right, so that should give you an idea. As you can see, it goes on for a considerable time. And here, what I'm passing through is both daughters-in-law, and one of them will leave and Ruth will remain. And then when she remains, she gives her sort of account of her faith and the sort of, being good to your mother-in-law and faith in the one true Lord are closely associated.
老爹，我向你保证，我会好好活落去。你爱听我的话，赶紧回转去后头厝。婆婆，你莫催我倒转去，你往哪里去，我就往哪里去。你住倒位，我就住倒位。你的国就是我的国。你的心就是我的心，爸爸。
So that's the famous words of Ruth. Your country shall be my country, your Lord shall be my Lord. And she refuses to go and instead will remain and serve Naomi. So as you can see, for both the themes of traditional ethics and filial piety, as well as the maybe also the national aspect, but the feeling of conversion, the feeling that you can enter in the Old Testament, of course, it's Judaism, but by performing this, I think implicitly it's a conversion to Christianity that is being hailed and celebrated. So that's Ruth. Another of the popular productions has been Joseph's New Coat. Again, an Old Testament story, probably familiar to many of you. You can see Joseph fighting with his brothers there. And we will take a look. So maybe you're familiar with the story of Potiphar's wife. Joseph is the target seduction attempt by an Egyptian sort of official's wife, because he's so handsome and attractive. And 4930. Sorry, I'm just trying to get the right plates. And he rejects her advances, and then she accuses him of him of making advances. So one of the early, rather misogynistic moments of the Old Testament, but again, might be an interesting moment to take a look at how it's being adapted. So I'll give you a bit of a visual first. All right, so I think some aspects of the adaptation should be clear. You can see that there's a sort of use of slapstick. The names of the characters are altered to match Chinese conventions, but we're set sort of in a place where the Egyptians have become the Han Chinese, and the Jews have become a minority called the White Tribe, which is an actual minority in Yunnan, but there's not a lot of other specificity around it. The characters don't wear ethnically specific makeup, but the narrative is slotted into a vaguely Chinese imperial structure. The Han Egyptians are wealthier, they control the bureaucracy and represent a hegemonic culture, and members of the white tribes, that is the Jews, are impoverished monotheists, and they seem to be under Han occupation. The God-fearing white tribe are famous for making a certain kind of golden thread, much coveted by the Han, and so we don't have a multicolored dream coat as you might have in Andrew Lloyd Webber, but instead we have a golden coat. And the set uses sort of generic painted backgrounds of mountains and fields or of the court, while chairs and tables and inkwash paintings of Pharaoh's court are the same as you might find in Gezaixi set in Yamen's or mandarins' homes. And the costumers add vaguely Middle Eastern turbans, caps, and mustaches to otherwise standard robes, skirts, and trousers. The incident with Potiphar's wife is adapted in order to reflect morality as it usually is in Chinese theater. So in the wife in the Bible, she clearly intends adultery. The quote in the Bible is, "And it came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast her eyes upon Joseph, and she said, 'Lie with me.'" But in Joseph's new coat, so in this version, the equivalent character, the wife you've just seen, she's got an excuse for being alone with Joseph, which is furnished by the king's wife, who wishes to make a special gift of the thread to the queen mother on her birthday, and so she's there. This Potiphar's wife, Yu Chunyun, is there to get the secret from Joseph. Once alone with Joseph, she's guilty of indiscretion, and as you can see, she is making a move on him. But what she's trying to do in the Chinese text is to marry Joseph, presumably after she's obtained a divorce. And she's not just trying to seduce him, to bed him, as she is in the Bible, which makes her a sort of recoverable character, as she will be by the plot, because the plot of Gezaixi more or less requires that everybody be morally recovered. So she's interrupted by her husband a little later in the scene, and then accuses Joseph of indecent advances. But then she and the king's wife will also be the people who are working behind the scenes in order to get Joseph to interpret the dreams of the Pharaoh, and then to reward him later in the plot. And so the character is morally more ambivalent. She sort of made a misstep here, but is recovered. So the inclusion of the king's wife is an example. Doesn't play a major role in the Bible, or the Pharaoh's wife, but is included here probably because Gezaixi requires a lot of female characters, and so we see in their choice of text and then their adaptation a lot of additional female characters. It also more or less requires a romantic plot, and Joseph doesn't really have one. And so they've added the character. On the right is the queen's wife, the Pharaoh's wife, and on the left you have the romantic interest, was the daughter of the jailer, so a fellow Jew or white tribe member. And the jail keeper provides another important Gezaixi element that would otherwise be missing, which is the comic relief. So there's a lot of sort of slapstick and comedy around him. And so you have a real sort of, a lot of the plot is devoted to bringing Joseph and the jail keeper's daughter together. And whereas in the Bible, Joseph's wife, Asenath, receives only the briefest of mentions. So these adaptations of the plot have both structural and ethical aspects. The much increased prominence of female characters helps the play fit into the traditional arrangements of Taiwanese opera plots, which is something acknowledged by some of the practitioners. It includes the necessary romantic strand, and the transgressive female sexual desire at the heart of the Genesis story is domesticated, representing an excessive and unseemly, but no longer an adulterous desire. Pharaonic Egypt is transformed into the usual sort of historically flattened Sichu setting, maybe in Yunnan, but without any great sort of specific locality. All right, we move on. I'm conscious of the time, so we'll move on to the missionary theater. The main missionary figure is this Canadian missionary, George Leslie Mackay. Today I looked up to jog my memory just how many teeth Mackay had extracted, because he is best known as a medical missionary. And the answer, we noted all the teeth that he extracted in his diary, and there were 21,000. So a great moment in the history of Taiwanese dentistry. As you can see from his family photo, he married a Taiwanese convert and had several children, and is still remembered today both for the foundation of what is now Alethea College on the left in Danshui, where his missionary activity was concentrated, and the foundation of medical institutes, which are now one of Taiwan's major chains of hospitals and medical care, the Mackay Memorial Hospital. So that's obviously a modern picture, but it's he's I would say universally known in Taiwan for his activities as an educational and medical missionary. He's also very popular on the stage, partly because he doesn't bring a narrative that derives from China or from Japan. He arrives in Taiwan in 1844. He spends more than 30 years there. He learns Taiwanese Hokkien and no other Chinese language. He works with the Aboriginals. He's there during the bombing of the Danshui harbor by the French. The work that he writes from far Formosa is one of the most sort of important ethnographic accounts we have of the late 19th century in Taiwan. And despite post-colonial tendencies and the general disrepute, I think, that missionaries have in other parts of Asia and well, the rest of the world, Mackay's reputation remains very strong and very positive, I think partly because he represents somebody whose connection is directly with the people of Taiwan, rather than with Qing officials or any of the later governmental entities, the Japanese colonial period or the nationalist government, right? He's working directly with the Taiwanese people, and of course he has specific medical and educational legacies. So here we can see him in puppetry form. This is a potehi. Puppetry is equally associated with Taiwanese identity as Taiwanese opera is. That's the DVD, but it's been performed many times. Here you can see some stills. It's the puppeteer who you see there on the right won't subtitle it in standard Chinese, so it's subtitled either in this sort of the mixed form where Hokkien is mixed with phonetic transcription, or entirely in the church romanization, which is preferred by the Presbyterian Church, Mackay, a Presbyterian missionary associated with that church and its transliteration practices. There's also an aspect of linguistic nationalism that we won't go into here, but the whole production, you can get it in Hakka, you can get it in Japanese, I think you can get it in English, you can get it in Romanized, but it won't have a standard Chinese, that is to say Mandarin-ish subtitles for nationalist reasons. In 2008, so in the Chen Shui-bian years when Taiwan was under a very pro-sovereignty government, there was for the first time a Taiwanese language Western style opera, which again was focused on Mackay and took as its title Black Bearded Bible Man, which is a which is and performed in the National Theater. Black-bearded Bible Man is one of the monikers that Mackay was given while he was there. And just recently, there's been a sort of, so what's called 国乐, so national music, meaning traditional Chinese folk music opera, so separate from either Western style opera or from Taiwanese Chinese opera. So in an orchestral tradition with Chinese musicians, there's been just recently yet another dramatization of Mackay's life, and you can see there on the left that the beard is there being used to symbolize that he's a white guy, that he's a European, and on the right you have his wife. In some ways similar to the Joseph story, there's a tendency in all of the Mackay stories to focus on the love story. That's sort of a sine qua non of dramatization. I think if we actually look at what Mackay writes about his wife, or what we have from other sources about his wife, it's the late 19th century. She is a convert from very humble means. I think it is not so much about the swelling music and the wonderful romance. Most of that is imagination. We don't have any sources that put it in those terms, that put it in kind of 20th, 21st century terms. It's much more an ordinary, practical late 19th century marriage for between a missionary and a convert. But I think it's understandable to project romance onto these shows for the needs of the audience, or maybe I'm just a terrible cynic. And this is the Gezaixi version. So you can see the full title, Great Wave Strikes the Shore, Taiwan's Son-in-Law Mackay. You can see from the title that, again, national identity is foregrounded. You have Mackay, so beardless Mackay is young Mackay, so that's the woman on the left, of the woman kneeling in the picture on the left, and the woman standing on the left in the other picture. That's, again, the romantic story between Mackay and his wife. On the left, beneath the illuminated crucifix, is young Mackay sort of foreseeing old Mackay, and old Mackay thinking back on what he was hoping to achieve and what he wanted for Taiwan when he arrived. And so this was a popular Gezaixi production that toured quite a lot around Taiwan in the years that I was there. So these productions I was lucky enough to see while I was living in Taiwan. Here you can see some of the productions. Again, if there's a bit of sort of beard on the one actress's face on the production on the left, that's in order to indicate that is Mackay. And then on the right, the excitement about the vegetables with the cabbage and the carrot is because Mackay is also credited with certain agricultural advances. And maybe we will just have time to have the briefest of, this is sort of a trailer to the beginning of this production when it was shown on television. All right. So perhaps you also saw his mission to the Aboriginals there. Again, there's maybe questions about representations of Aboriginals on the Taiwanese stage. And also you may have noticed him heroically pulling a tooth. So all of the major hits of Makai's career are represented in this show. And then finally, I wanted to end with this production, which is interesting to me because it's the first that I'm aware of. It's just less than a year old. And this is in California. So we're now seeing gospel Taiwanese opera being produced also in the churches of the Taiwanese churches of California. And we'll maybe just have a very brief moment where we see a group of parishioners singing the Taiwan I Love in a Taiwanese opera version.
歌戏团演出开始，请掌声鼓励。Now may I present to you the Taiwanese opera from Chinese Theatrical Church of San Diego.
And it goes on. I wanted to show you one that was actually in diaspora and in a church, and bringing in sort of that's a secular song, but then other elements that continue there are more explicitly Christian, but bringing together the sort of nationalist themes that sometimes occur in Taiwanese opera with presence in diaspora. With an explicit church setting. So again, sort of stepping back to my position as a theater scholar, what's really fascinating about these troupes and these productions is that they can only sort of exist, I think, in an area, in a place where we have no strong intervention or government regulation of what you can do either in the field of religion or of theater. So it remains for me quite hard to imagine any type of religious or Christian theater of this kind occurring in the PRC, and probably also not in Hong Kong or Singapore. At least I haven't come across anything similar. I think it's a sort of positive sign for Gezaixi, which is sometimes Taiwanese opera, which is sometimes thought to be in crisis because younger people aren't as interested. And you will have seen that a lot of the people involved are middle-aged or older. But I think it's a good sign that there are other sources of sponsoring and of interest, not only from the temples, but now also from Christianity. It really makes sure that it's a living tradition that can adapt different stories. I think it's an interesting sign for Christianity in Taiwan to be able to adapt these, Holy Land stories, these typically Old Testament stories, into Taiwanese language and theatrical systems and moral systems in a way that is very productive and very indigenous, very local Taiwanese, if you want to put it that way, which is an interesting development because Christianity did for a long time have a reputation of being somewhat westernized or somewhat elite in Taiwan. And I think it means that Gezaixi can really attach itself to a variety of religions on Taiwan, a great diversity of religions on Taiwan, and that on the other hand, Christianity on Taiwan is able to make use of a wider range of cultural forms than we have seen anywhere else in the Chinese-speaking world. So I welcome your questions. I thank you for your patience. And and as I say, if you don't feel like you would like to ask a question just now, feel free to also be in touch by email. My email is there in the corner. So Thanks.